Hey folks, Steve here with another special Highway to the Kremlin 2 video for you today. This video is going to be kicking off a retreat scenario. And I shouldn't really say scenario, I should say campaign, because I am planning on playing this, I guess, to some completion, as best as I can expect to anyway. Now, I've chosen to do this because in our campaign playthrough, much adverse to history, and there's a lot of reasons to unpack my poor Russian play. The French won. They brought the Tsar to some terms, though it's hard to judge exactly what that would have been. But I thought, well, hey, okay, we got to a pretty deep part of the game. We were getting into turns 21, turns 22, when things had kind of petered out. But there's a whole other side of this game that we should play. If we're going to say, hey, we really played this game, we should expect the other half, which is the French failing to bring the Tsar to terms and having to retreat out of Russia, uh, um, being chased and dogged and uh, chipped away at the entire time home. So it makes sense to try to play that as well, just because we can. Now that's going to be a bit funky, so we're going to be starting this as a campaign game. This is the start of scenario 4 you have in front of you here. So scenario 4 is pretty deep in the game. It starts on turn 24 out of 34, which means that as we play through, if we play this turn 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 whole total turns to be played here, which means that this sort of mini section of my coverage should only be a couple of videos long. Again, we've talked enough about mechanics and all the troubles at this point to kind of go through things pretty quickly. So I'm going to try to talk in this video kind of the considerations here, and maybe we'll get to playing here. The video, the title should indicate to you how far along I get. Now, this scenario starts with, indeed, a line of communication traced from the west side of the map, really Kovno, uh, not Drissa. So we are stuck in the historical timeline where the French are tracing supply all the way, all the way, all the way out to Moscow, and Napoleon himself sits in Moscow, just right up here. Now, nearby, Murat is sitting in a precarious position, and before him is basically the main primary and decently large Russian army that has Barclay out of the game, Bagration dead, and instead we have Benigzin as our subordinate, along with Platov, with Kutuzov in this area here. And we've got a couple other major generals and minor leaders kind of strewn about in that cluster of brown counters there, with their center of operations out of Kaluga, their line of supply just off camera here at this edge of the map. So south of the Moscow position. The French have their center of operations in Smolensk, which is currently occupied and garrisoned by Victor, who has a fair number of strength points. And at this point, like, we're not going to be rolling, I think, um, any negotiation die rolls. Like, I think this scenario will assume that Napoleon's going to have to retreat. So we're going to begin that retreat. We have 11 turns to get back home, and ideally with as many French units, French strength points as we can manage. So there's a couple different ways to look at this. One is certainly we should be picking up our garrisons on the way home, but only pulling them out when we know, like, hey, we are done with this part of the map. And obviously, the Russians are going to be incentivized to take, let's say, a different route. So maybe going this way and trying to cut off the French. Really, Napoleon can't afford to do much else than to try to run home. Now, historically, there was this whole thing of heading south into this province, which I don't know that it makes sense to do in this setup. I'm just looking at it thinking, like, what is there to be gained, other than maybe a chance to stop over and get some forage value out of Kaluga itself or some of these other locations, because there are a couple of these secondary towns around here, and a primary town in Kaluga that might be worth some forage value. I'm not sure. That's going to be the tricky part. Like I need to think about how am I getting home? Am I going to be moving fast enough to pick up these garrisons? But then also, in the reality is I really can't. I can't do a lockstep kind of thing. I need to kind of go. Um, so how we do it, I'm a little unsure. Right? We could move up, drop off a guy here, go here. These pick up. They move like this. We move like this. But that might not be enough turns to get home. That's what I'm worried about. Might have to leave some garrisons behind. Might have to think about like how do I, as we pick up garrisons, we pick up strength points. We get stronger, which then also maybe makes attrition more likely as we get larger and larger SP size. And if the uh, Russians can actually cut off the line of supply at various points, that could really prove to be a nasty turn of events. So the French are stuck playing a time game and to try to consolidate and get home. That's a very different feel from the original start of this campaign, right? Where we're worried about expansion, creating good solid lines of communication, and continuing to advance. Here we need to modulate our size of our forces, the attrition we're taking as we try to leave. We're leaving, unfortunately, right as winter is going to start to kick in earnest, which I think is going to be pretty devastating. And the only other thing we can hope for is that the Russian activations elsewhere around the map are slow to occur. So looking around the map for a second, there is Wittgenstein here. He's alive. He's got some forces. There's a major general there as well. So they're kind of this thorn in our side. Essen is still up in Riga. He could prove to be annoying. We also have Austin Sakin and another leader down here with some forces. So these could, snake their way up and cause a whole bunch of problems. The only thing is, they're pretty terrible leaders to activate. So I don't expect that these leaders are going to activate very much, but certainly they're going to be trying to beeline to say Kovno and mess up the French line of communication. And if they can do that, that could be the death knell for the French army. So it's going to be a highly, I think, tense situation where the early part of the campaign you're really looking to find some really critical event that's going to maybe defeat the Russians. Here the French are going to be desperate to try to get to some safety, maybe around Orsha, maybe around probably Borisov would be a nice place to get back to, where if we can consolidate the French forces there, then they can have a safer trip home. I guess that's kind of the thought here. The Russians would love to bag Napoleon. That would be a great way to end the campaign, is to bag him and end his reign potentially. There's a lot of things that we can do. It's just going to be tricky to see what we'll be able to execute. Now, certainly, I think the Russians have a strength point advantage right now in terms of where they're clustered and where they can operate. They can certainly cause a lot of trouble for the French, even from the outset, and they likely would like to beat up on Murat, which happened historically. So a lot of that is kind of coming into play here. Do we be really aggressive as the Russians? There might be a really great reward for that if we can cut off Napoleon in Moscow, even, and just wrap him up. I mean, I think the very early turns of this scenario are going to be perhaps the most important, because Napoleon could get bagged. He could be defeated, and we could eliminate him, and that I think is an instant loss for the French in that case. So precarious position. Things really have to move, and move quickly to make a real dent. We'll see how it goes. Now there's still reinforcements that could come in. I also have the partisans on the map. I am not playing with vedettes, but I am playing with partisans because partisans matter. And I'm trying to be fair to the French with the idea that, like vedettes, partisans at the beginning of a scenario have to set up with leaders, and since they come in as reinforcements near Moscow, I'm choosing to put them with the leaders at Moscow rather than some far off place where they could like sneakily race up and cause even more havoc than they probably should. So the idea being, they're starting over here, they can, move and create disruptions along the main line of garrisons there as just annoyances. The thing we'll have to be careful as the Russians, though, is yes, those partisans can be dispersed and destroyed really easily, and then they don't come back. So we have four of the four, but they'll get busted up pretty quick by the French if the French pay attention, which obviously I will be. With no fog of war, it's a little less it's a little less exciting than trying to chase down these partisans and maybe come across some segment of the main Russian army under Kutuzov. So here it's going to be a lot more deliberate. Again, no fog of war. We're going to play it as we can. So quite a lot at play here. I think if you think about how hard the French might need to push to run home, that's going to be one aspect of this, right? Like they could choose to move the greatest amount possible, but incur more attrition that way, especially on forced marches. So, do we even try to force march? That I'm unsure. I think that's going to be tricky. As the Russians, this is definitely a good situation for them to be in. They just need to think more about how do they leverage their forces to really goof up the French. I believe victory in this case is going to be adjudicated by looking at how many strength points make it back to friendly territory as the French, how many strength points are there, not in Russia, compared to the total number of Russian strength points on the map across the whole map. So that's kind of the calculus here. And just looking at it, like I'm not sure what this is going to really turn out to look like. I'm less worried about the true victory conditions because I do just want to play through the experience. But I will be trying to make sense of that strength point comparison, and I'll need to decide whether or not garrisons matter or not. So we'll have to look at that. But that's the setup here, guys. Really looking at it, I think this is going to be a really tough one for the French. Obviously, they're at 0 morale. So anytime that the Russians get back into Moscow or Smolensk, the French are going to lose a morale point, is how I'm going to treat that, based best as I can tell, reading the rule books. Like that's what you should do. You should negate a point for the Russians retaking something. We don't really know how many victory points the French got for taking these cities because it's all kind of a wash. But if you factor the numbers out, if they're at 0 right now, it is just easier to say that the French are going to lose one, right? That's ignoring the die roll. They would have gained one. They're going to lose one anyway when they lose Moscow and Smolensk. So it's going to be very likely that the French are going to be dealing with a Paris morale track eventually of at least a -2, if not more, and that's going to be worse for their attrition. So, as you can imagine, this is going to be bad for the French. The fun or the challenge for the French player here would be, how much can we get back home, right? That's a different sort of challenge. You're not here to win the war. You're here to get home. So there's a certain fun factor in that alone, but certainly the odds are stacked against you. And the Russian player, despite losing Moscow, is happy to attrit away the French forces. The Russian army never fully being destroyed in the field. They have this opportunity to chase Napoleon back to France. And ultimately the wars of 1813 and the German liberation, which is a whole different game. We'll maybe play that at some point. All right, so we're going to try to get started here, guys. We're going to try to get started. Returning to the strength point count, I did do a quick check, and it could be that I'm missing something, but we'll figure it out along the way, I guess. The count here, this is kind of chicken scratch, I'm sorry, but the French have 56 strength points plus 20 garrisons on map. So it's 76 at the start of this. The Russians have 61 strength points in their various forces and leaders. They have 9 garrisons that are just default on the map. And then there's so that would be 70. Now, looking at it there, it would incentivize and even force the Russians to engage the French because the French have an advantage. If they get everything home and there's no big fight at all, like the French win, right? That puts an impetus on the Russian player to fight and engage and actively try to disrupt the French. So that feels good. That feels right. However, there's the whole thing when you set up the depots that you can potentially uh, with the unspecified Russian depots, Russian garrisons for currently French occupied depot towns may set up in another depot hex within communications. And as I try to work through it, I could add 10 more garrisons that are represented by counters that the Russians have lost all along the south end of the map here if I wanted to, based on the tracing. And that would kick it up to 80 for the Russians, and they're good to go. Uh, and then they would force the French player maybe to have to do something. But that feels awfully gamey. That feels weird, and I don't like it. Now the other thing is, if I spend out all these garrisons, the Russians won't be able. They won't have any counters to place their own depots along the way to ensure that they're maintaining their control of the highway and reestablishing their own goods line of communication network through this region, which they would want to do, I think. So this is a little funky, guys, and again, this is where like rough around the edges this system, like, okay, I'm playing a later campaign, but if I take all the rules together, here's this weird like trick slash situation that I can just do. Like, is there anything really stopping me from doing that? And I would think the problem would be, because the hexes here don't have, functionally aren't working. If the Russians don't have, it's like I don't think they're functional. Like Vitebsk, I don't think is functional because the French had moved through there at one point or another, even if the garrison is gone now. Um, so if the Russians want their own to maintain their own line of communication, they do need to re garrison along the main line, right? At least that's how I choose to understand this. So I probably wouldn't want to then uh, put all those garrisons down there because I'm expecting to have to use these counters, elsewhere. And so there's just something weird there, guys. And I feel a lot more comfortable with saying um, that I'm not going to use all those garrisons down south. Like, there's a couple of obvious places that I might want to use them. And so uh, I'm not sure the best way to deal with this. I think what I probably want to do is put a couple of garrisons out, ones that make sense, like along this line here, and then just wait and see what else happens. Because here's the thing: if right now the spread is either the difference between the the strength point comparison is the French have 6 more at game start, or the Russians have 70 or 80. That's really the swing, is we have like in excess a bunch of garrisons that I wasn't going to use otherwise, that don't start on the map and I could place if I wanted to. Maybe it's going to be worth comparing this at the end. So I've gotten it written down, right? The French on map right now have 76, and it's how many get home. Um, do we pick up the garrisons to get them home? That's going to be worthwhile, right? So 76 French. Russian maybe have 70, but could really be up to 80. And we'll look at this at the end of the campaign and see if the swing matters, because there's basically, again, a swing of 10 here that may matter. Either the Russians start with 6 less or they start with 4 more than the French player, and I'm really more interested in seeing like, well, what does this all look like at the end? Um, do the French get 76 strength points into East Prussia and Poland, or is it only going to be a lot less than that? And then do the Russians get um, to maintain a decent number themselves? I think the game is more interesting with considering the Russians having 70 and the French have 76. So if the Russians have an actual need to mess with the French. So we'll just see. Again, this is almost like I don't look at this scenario as worthwhile playing. Um, like if you were to play this as a part of your campaign because the French just failed, like I think that's going to be fine because the depot situation is going to be whatever the natural progression of your campaign allowed for, right? Here, because we're starting at scenario 4 and there's this weird garrison setup thing that we need to look at, that just makes it feel a little funkier. And um, what I might do is even peel off a couple more and leave it, take even 3 more off and make this a little more, even more tense that the Russians have to do something more to make a difference. So I'm going to make another note here. Anything that any garrison that's not called out specifically, I'm going to leave off map, and then we'll see uh, whether or not the Russians can re-garrison some of these locations. Some of these depots I would consider have never having been entered by the French, and so have a active, have a potential active depot there because they're in a line of communication just with no garrison. And again, we'll compare the numbers at the end. Um, would make a lot more sense if this was an extension of a real campaign. Ours is not, so we're going to have to fudge some numbers. It's more of an experience, in my opinion, than a competitive situation because these numbers are funky. And I don't like that, but again, this game has rough edges, and we're dealing with them. So, yeah, there you go, guys. So we're gonna start the action again. What more is there to do here? There's going to be some defensive posturing out on the left wing of the overall French invasion. Same thing with down here on the right wing, Schwarzenberg having to watch the flank, and then Victor kind of being the final reserve, in the hope that Napoleon and Murat can try to get the heck out of Dodge. But unfortunately, Murat is very likely going to get wrapped up by the Russians. It's hard to imagine that he does not get his ass whooped, and maybe, I mean, there's enough French, or I'm sorry, not French, Russian counters there. They could surround Murat, honestly. So I'm wondering if this is a well thought out start position because I know Murat gets messed up pretty badly, but I don't think he gets bagged, and Murat ends up involved in the retreat all the way to the end, I believe. So we'll play it through and we'll see what happens, guys. But that's the intro to the retreat campaign scenario that we're going to start. I think I'm just going to leave this as a video actually because I'm yapping enough. We're kind of setting the stage, and there's plenty more to run into over the life of the scenario. So we'll go from there, and we'll let this continue on into the next video where we'll likely cover several turns all at once. Again, this is an 11 turn scenario, so you figure if we do several turns in a video with plenty of commentary, that's just going to be a handful of videos. So we'll see you in the next one, guys. Take care. Keep gaming.